A clash of duty and ego. The fire truck barreled down the quiet suburban streets, its sirens piercing the calm of the evening. Smoke plumes darkened the horizon, signaling a fire that was growing far beyond control. Inside the truck, Captain Marcus Hayes sat tensely in the front seat, his eyes glued to the road ahead. Behind him, the team prepared themselves for what could be a critical mission. "That's a lot of smoke," remarked Jake, a young firefighter in his second year of service. His voice carried a mix of awe and dread as he adjusted his helmet. "Thick and black," muttered Drew, the driver, his voice steady but grim. "If anyone's still in there, they're running out of time." Hayes nodded without turning. "Eyes on the prize, team. Remember your training. No hesitation, no mistakes. We're in, we're out, and we save lives. That's the job." The fire truck rounded a corner, and Drew cursed under his breath. Blue and red lights flickered in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing them, its siren competing with theirs. "What in the—" Jake began, his words trailing into disbelief. Is he trying to pull us over?" "Unbelievable," said Drew, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We're running code, sirens blaring, and this guy's trying to stop us." Captain Hayes leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Stay focused. Protocol's protocol. If a cop orders you to stop, you stop, even if it costs lives." Jake snapped, his frustration evident. Hayes shot him a look through the rearview mirror, one that silenced any further protest. "I don't like it any more than you do. But we're not making this situation worse by breaking more rules. Everyone, stay calm." Drew slowed the truck to a halt, the burning house now just a few blocks away. The team could almost feel the heat in the air, an ominous reminder of the urgency they faced. The police cruiser screeched to a stop behind them, and the officer emerged with deliberate strides. He was tall and broad, his uniform crisp, and his expression cold. "Evening," the officer barked, coming to a halt by the driver's side. His name badge read Warren. "License and registration." Hayes leaned across the cab, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Warren, we're firefighters responding to an emergency. There's a house fire just a few blocks ahead. Lives are at risk." Warren didn't flinch. "I don't care what the emergency is. You're driving recklessly and endangering others. Rules apply to everyone, even you." "Reckless," Jake burst out from the back. "We're saving lives. That's our job." "Quiet," Hayes said sharply, his eyes still locked on Warren. "Officer, we're operating under emergency response protocols. We have the right of way." "Not on my watch," Warren snapped. "Step out of the vehicle." The team exchanged incredulous glances. Hayes took a deep breath, knowing this interaction was spiraling in the worst way. "Officer," he began again, his tone measured, "if we delay any longer, people could die. Surely you understand that." "I set out," Warren interrupted, his hand moving to his belt. The implication was clear. This isn't a negotiation. The tension inside the truck was palpable. Drew gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while Jake looked like he might jump out of the vehicle on his own. Hayes felt the weight of his team's frustration, their readiness to act being stifled by bureaucratic obstinance. Reluctantly, Hayes opened the door and stepped down from the truck. He was a tall man, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor commanding respect, but Warren remained unmoved. The rest of the team followed suit, each one brimming with barely contained anger. "We're wasting time," Drew muttered under his breath, his fists clenched at his sides. Warren eyed the group with a mix of suspicion and disdain. "You firefighters think you're above the law, don't you? Running around, sirens blaring, like the rules don't apply. Well, they do." "We don't have time for this," Hayes said, his voice low but firm. "There's a family that could be trapped in that house. Every second we waste here, their chances of survival drop." "And I told you," Warren shot back, "rules are rules. Now stand there and wait while I check your vehicle." The absurdity of the situation struck Hayes like a punch to the gut. He could practically feel the heat from the blaze they were meant to extinguish, the smoke visible just over the rooftops. Yet here they were, detained by a power-hungry cop who seemed more interested in asserting his authority than preserving lives. "Is this a joke?" Jake finally burst out, his voice loud and angry. "There's a house on fire, and you're worried about us breaking traffic laws. You're insane." "That's enough," Hayes barked, his voice sharp. "We're not escalating this." Warren took a step closer to Jake, his posture threatening. "Watch your tone, son, unless you want to spend the night in a cell." The words hung in the air like a slap. Hayes stepped between them, his presence a buffer against what felt like an inevitable clash. "Officer Warren," he said evenly, "this isn't the time or the place. Let us do our jobs, and we'll deal with any complaints after the emergency is handled." But Warren wasn't listening. He turned his back on Hayes and walked toward the fire truck, circling it like a predator. The firefighters stood helpless, watching their precious minutes slip away. Hayes clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration boiling beneath his composed exterior. And then, through the haze of smoke and tension, came the sound that changed everything. A scream. High-pitched, terrified, and unmistakably human. It cut through the standoff like a knife, freezing everyone in place. Jake's head snapped toward the direction of the fire. "That's a kid," he shouted. "There are kids in there." For a moment, even Warren looked shaken, but it was Hayes who acted first. He turned to his team, his voice a commanding roar. "Gear up. Move out now." The firefighters sprang into action, their training taking over. They bolted for the truck, grabbing their gear with practiced efficiency. Warren moved to block their path, but Hayes stepped in front of him, his voice a low growl. "Get out of our way, or I swear to God, I'll drag you to that house myself and make you explain to a dying child why you stopped us." For the first time, Warren hesitated, but it was only for a moment. His face hardened again, and his hand moved to his radio. "You're not going anywhere," he snapped. "Backup is on the way." Hayes didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed his helmet, turned on his heels, and started running toward the fire, his team right behind him. The sound of Warren shouting into his radio faded into the background, replaced by the roar of flames and the desperate cries for help that spurred the firefighters onward. They didn't know it yet, but the family they were about to save, and the officer determined to stop them, would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. A clash of duty, ego, and justice was only beginning. Into the inferno. The screams echoed over the rooftops as Captain Marcus Hayes and his team sprinted toward the blaze, their heavy boots pounding against the pavement. The fire loomed ahead like an angry beast, roaring with a ferocity that sent chills through even the most seasoned firefighters. Flames licked at the edges of the house, their orange glow casting a hellish light across the street. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, blotting out the setting sun. "Gear up fast," Hayes ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not losing anyone tonight." Jake, Drew, and the rest of the crew moved like a well-oiled machine, strapping on oxygen masks, checking their hoses, and readying the tools they would need to break through the inferno. Hayes pulled on his helmet, his jaw set with grim determination. The clock was ticking, and every second lost felt like a lifetime. As the team approached the burning house, the full scale of the disaster came into view. Flames had engulfed the upper floors, and the roof was sagging ominously. A woman stood on the lawn, clutching a young child to her chest. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, her screams hoarse as she pointed toward the second floor. "My husband," she cried, her voice cracking. "And my daughter. They're still inside." Jake's grip on the hose tightened. "We've got to move now." Hayes didn't hesitate. "Drew, Jake, you're with me. Sam, stay with the truck and manage the pump. Eli, secure the perimeter and keep the crowd back." The firefighters moved into position with practiced efficiency. Hayes turned to the woman, his voice calm but urgent. "Ma'am, we're going to get them out. Stay here with your son. You're safe now." But just as they prepared to enter the house, the screech of tires and the blare of sirens shattered the moment. Another police cruiser had arrived, and 2 officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters. Among them was Officer Warren, who had apparently called for backup. "You're disobeying a direct order," Warren shouted, storming toward Hayes. "This is a crime scene now, and I'm not letting anyone interfere." Hayes turned to face him, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. "A crime scene? This is a rescue operation. There are people trapped inside that house, and you're wasting precious time with this nonsense." The second officer, a younger man with a nervous demeanor, looked between Hayes and Warren, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Sir," he began, addressing Warren, "shouldn't we let them do their job? There are kids in there." "Stay out of this, Carter," Warren snapped. "These firefighters think they're above the law, and I'm not letting them get away with it." Hayes stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "If you don't stand down, Officer Warren, you'll be the one explaining to the chief why 2 people died tonight because you couldn't set your ego aside." For a moment, Warren faltered, the weight of Hayes's words sinking in. But the fire was relentless, and there was no time to argue further. Hayes turned on his heel and barked orders to his team. "Go. We're going in now." Jake and Drew followed Hayes as he charged toward the front door, their equipment at the ready. The heat was suffocating, even with their protective gear. Smoke poured from the shattered windows, and the roar of the flames was deafening. Inside, visibility was nearly zero, the air thick with smoke and ash. "Stay close," Hayes shouted, his voice muffled by his mask. "We split up on the 2nd floor. Jake, you check the left wing. Drew, take the right. I'll clear the main hallway." The team nodded and moved with purpose, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Hayes kicked open a door, revealing a living room engulfed in flames. Furniture smoldered, and the walls were charred black. He swept the room quickly, his trained eyes searching for any signs of life. "Nothing here," he called out, moving to the next room. Meanwhile, Jake climbed the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The heat intensified with every step, and the structure groaned ominously under the strain of the fire. At the top of the stairs, he spotted a small figure curled up in a corner, her face hidden behind her arms. "Got one," he shouted, rushing forward. "Hey, sweetheart, it's okay. I'm here to help." The girl looked up, her face streaked with tears and soot. She couldn't have been older than 6. Jake scooped her up in his arms, cradling her protectively as he made his way back down the stairs. "Through," he called out. "I've got the daughter. Where's the husband?" Drew's voice crackled over the radio. "Still searching. I'm in the back bedroom. Walls are caving in. I need backup. Hang tight. I'm on my way," Hayes replied, his adrenaline spiking. He sprinted toward Drew's location, the floor creaking dangerously beneath his feet. Flames licked at the walls, and debris rained down from the ceiling as the house began to collapse. Drew was crouched near a collapsed beam, struggling to free a man who was pinned beneath it. The man was conscious, but barely, his face pale and covered in soot. Hayes dropped to his knees beside Drew, assessing the situation. "We need to move him now," Hayes said, his voice urgent. "This whole place is coming down." "Beam's too heavy," Drew grunted, his muscles straining. "We need the spreaders." "Jake's got the girl. He'll be back with the gear in 60 seconds, Hayes said, his tone resolute. "We hold until then." Outside, the crowd had grown, drawn by the spectacle of the blaze. Among them was Officer Warren, who stood near his cruiser, his expression unreadable. The young officer, Carter, approached him hesitantly. "Sir," Carter said quietly, "maybe we should." "Enough, Carter," Warren snapped, but his voice lacked its usual authority. For the first time, Doubt crept into his eyes as he watched the firefighters risk everything to save the lives inside the inferno. Back inside, Hayes and Drew finally managed to free the man as Jake returned with the spreaders. Together, they carried him out of the house, their breaths labored and their bodies aching. The moment they emerged into the fresh air, the crowd erupted into cheers. The woman on the lawn ran to them, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her daughter and husband. "Thank you," she sobbed, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving my family." Hayes removed his helmet, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "Just doing our job, Mom," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. But as he turned to head back to the truck, his gaze locked with Officer Warren's. The cop's face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. Hayes didn't say a word, but his expression spoke volumes. This wasn't over. The fire within. The firefighters stood on the scorched lawn, sweat mixing with soot as the adrenaline of the rescue began to ebb. The once roaring inferno behind them had been tamed, but the house was a hollowed shell, a stark reminder of how close tragedy had come. Captain Marcus Hayes surveyed his team. Each of them bore the marks of the battle: torn gloves, smudged masks, and weary eyes. Yet, amidst the exhaustion, there was a shared sense of triumph. They had saved the family. The rescued father, barely able to stand, clung to his wife and daughter. "You saved us," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Hayes replied, his tone steady but kind. "This is why we do what we do." But the brief moment of relief was shattered when Officer Warren approached, his face a mask of simmering anger. Behind him, his partner, Officer Carter, lingered uncertainly, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell was that?" Warren barked, pointing at the smoldering house. "You ignored a direct order. You endangered everyone here, including yourselves." Jake, who was helping Drew coil the hose, stood abruptly, his temper flaring. "We endangered ourselves. Are you kidding me? We just saved 3 people because you were too busy playing traffic cop." "Jake," Hayes warned, his voice low but firm. "Stand down." "No, Captain," Jake shot back, stepping closer to Warren. "This guy needs to hear it. While we were risking our lives, he was too busy trying to flex his authority." Warren's hand twitched toward his belt, his posture stiffening. "Watch your tone, firefighter. You're already in enough trouble." Hayes stepped between them, his gaze locked on Warren. "Enough," he said, his voice like steel. "You've made your point. We'll address this later, after we've debriefed and checked on the family we just saved." But Warren wasn't done. He jabbed a finger at Hayes, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think you're untouchable because you wear that uniform. You don't get to decide when the law applies." Hayes felt the anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior, but he refused to let it surface. He'd dealt with men like Warren before, men who saw authority as a tool for control rather than service. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice measured. "Officer, you're right about one thing. No one is above the law. But tonight, the law wasn't what saved that family. It was this team. So maybe instead of pointing fingers, you should take a moment to think about what really matters." For a moment, Warren seemed taken aback, but his defiance quickly returned. "Don't lecture me, Captain. This isn't over. There will be consequences." Hayes didn't flinch. "Then we'll deal with them. But right now, I have a team to take care of." Warren's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. He turned sharply and walked back to his cruiser, barking orders at Carter to follow. The younger officer hesitated, glancing back at Hayes with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, before reluctantly joining his partner. The firefighters watched the patrol car pull away, the tension lingering like smoke in the air. Jake shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Unbelievable. That guy would have let them die just to prove a point." "He's not worth our energy," Hayes said, his voice steady but edged with weariness. "Let's focus on what we can control. Jake, help Drew secure the equipment. Sam, check the oxygen levels on the tanks. Eli, start the post-incident report. The team got to work, their movements mechanical but efficient. Hayes took a moment to step aside, his eyes scanning the scene. The family was being attended to by paramedics, and neighbors had begun to gather, their faces a mix of awe and gratitude. One elderly woman approached him hesitantly, clutching the shawl around her shoulders. "Captain," she said softly, her voice quivering, "thank you for what you did. That family is my neighbor. They're good people. If you hadn't been here—" Her voice trailed off, but Hayes offered a small, reassuring smile. "We were just doing our job, Mom." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You did more than that. You gave them a second chance." Hayes watched her walk away, her words settling heavily in his chest. A second chance. That's what they had fought for, risked everything for. But as he turned back to his team, he knew that second chances weren't always extended to everyone. Later that night, back at the firehouse, the mood was subdued. The team sat around the common area, nursing cups of coffee and tending to minor burns and scrapes. The exhaustion was palpable, but so was the lingering frustration. "I still can't believe that guy," Drew said, breaking the silence. "He wasn't just in the way. He was a danger to everyone." "He's the kind of cop who gives the good ones a bad name," Jake added bitterly. Carter didn't seem like a bad guy, though. He looked like he wanted to step in. "Doesn't matter," Sam said, shaking his head. "If you don't stand up against guys like Warren, you're part of the problem." Hayes listened quietly, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He understood their anger. It mirrored his own. But he also knew they couldn't let it consume them. "We'll deal with it," he said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. "There's going to be an investigation, no doubt about that. But our focus has to stay on the job. We don't let one bad experience shake who we are or why we do this." Jake sighed, slumping back in his chair. "Yeah, but what if it's more than one bad experience? What if it keeps happening?" Hayes met his gaze, his expression firm. "Then we fight back the right way. Through the system, through accountability. But we don't stoop to their level. We're better than that." The room fell silent, the weight of Hayes's words sinking in. Despite their frustration, they knew he was right. Their job was to save lives, not get caught in battles of ego and power. But even as they nodded in agreement, a shadow of doubt lingered in the room. Because deep down, they all knew this wasn't the end of the story. Aftermath and awakening. The following morning, Captain Marcus Hayes stood in the firehouse briefing room, staring at the incident report spread across the table. The pages were smudged with his handwriting, recounting every detail of the previous night's rescue. From the moment they received the call to the tense confrontation with Officer Warren. He'd written hundreds of reports in his career, but this one felt heavier than usual, weighed down by the knowledge that it wouldn't end here. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his concentration. Chief Elena Morales, a petite but commanding presence, entered the room. Her sharp eyes took in the scene. Hayes, the report, and the tension etched across his face. "Marcus," she began, her tone neutral but firm, "I read the preliminary report. Tell me what happened in your own words." Hayes gestured for her to sit, then launched into a detailed account. He spared no detail, recounting the delay caused by Warren, the escalating tension, and the eventual decision to act despite the officer's orders. When he finished, Morales leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "You defied a police officer's direct order, Marcus. You know what that means, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Hayes replied, his voice steady. "It means there'll be fallout. But I also know that if we'd waited, 2 people would be dead right now." Morales nodded slowly. "I don't disagree. But Warren's already filed a formal complaint against you and the team. He's claiming you endangered the public by ignoring protocol and acted recklessly by entering the structure without sufficient backup." Hayes's jaw tightened. That man's ego almost cost lives. if we hadn't acted when we did. I know, Morales interrupted, her tone softening. But Warren's a lieutenant with friends in high places. This isn't just about last night. It's about a pattern we've seen in this city for years. Power struggles between first responders, egos clashing where teamwork should prevail. With respect, Chief, it's more than egos, Hayes said, leaning forward. It's about accountability. Warren didn't just delay us. He endangered that family. And now he's trying to shift the blame. Morales studied him for a long moment. You're right, Marcus. And that's why I've already reached out to the mayor's office. They're launching an independent review of the incident. I've also filed a formal request with Internal Affairs to investigate Warren's actions. Hayes raised an eyebrow, surprised by her swift action. Internal Affairs. That's going to ruffle some feathers. Good, Morales said with a faint smile. Sometimes feathers need to be ruffled. But this won't be an easy fight. Warren's going to push back hard, and you need to be prepared. Across town, Officer Carter sat in the precinct locker room, staring at the floor. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, each moment more unsettling than the last. He'd joined the force to serve and protect, but standing there as Warren obstructed the firefighters, he felt like he'd failed that mission. Carter looked up as Warren entered, his demeanor as commanding as ever. You did good last night, Warren said, clapping him on the shoulder. Kept your head down, followed orders. Carter hesitated, his stomach churning. I'm not so sure, sir. Warren's hand froze mid-motion. He turned to face Carter, his expression hardening. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Carter took a deep breath, summoning his courage. It means I think we were wrong. Those firefighters saved lives, and we delayed them. I don't see how that was the right call. Warren's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Carter. You're new, so I'll chalk this up to inexperience. But questioning me in front of anyone else, that's a fast track to nowhere in this department. Carter clenched his fists, his conscience warring with his fear. With all due respect, sir, maybe we should be asking if following the rules blindly is worth someone's life. Warren stared at him for a long, tense moment before turning away. You'd do well to remember who you're talking to, rookie. Don't let idealism cloud your judgment. But as Warren walked out, Carter felt a spark of resolve. He didn't know how, but he vowed to ensure that the truth of that night wouldn't be buried under politics and ego. Later that week, the independent review began in earnest. Representatives from the mayor's office, fire department, and police department gathered in a neutral conference room. The air thick with tension. Captain Hayes, Chief Morales, Officer Carter, and Lieutenant Warren were all present, along with various witnesses and officials. The hearing opened with a review of the incident, each detail scrutinized with clinical precision. When it was Hayes' turn to speak, he rose, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions beneath. I've served as a firefighter for over 20 years, he began, his voice steady. In that time, I've seen the best and worst of humanity. But what happened that night wasn't just a bad decision. It was a failure of the very system meant to protect people. He recounted the events with unwavering clarity, emphasizing the urgency of the situation and the life-threatening consequences of the delay. We're not in this to win arguments or prove who's in charge, he said. We're here to save lives. And that's exactly what we did. When it was Warren's turn, he leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. I was enforcing the law, he said. Emergency vehicles don't get a free pass to endanger the public. The firefighters were speeding recklessly through residential streets. I acted to prevent a potential accident. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his conscience gnawing at him. Finally, he couldn't stay silent any longer. Permission to speak, he asked, his voice breaking the tension. The panel nodded, and Carter stood. I was there that night, he began, his voice trembling slightly. And I believe Captain Hayes and his team acted heroically. Yes, they were driving fast, but they were responding to an emergency. The family they saved wouldn't be here today if they'd followed Warren's orders to stop. Warren's face darkened, but Carter pressed on. "I joined the force to protect people, and I believe that means supporting those who are doing the same, even if they're in a different uniform. What happened that night wasn't about public safety, it was about control. And that's not what this job is about." The room fell silent, the weight of Carter's words hanging in the air. Hayes met his gaze, offering a small nod of respect. The review stretched late into the night, but by its conclusion, one thing was clear: change was coming. The findings highlighted the systemic issues that had allowed the incident to escalate, issues that had long gone unaddressed. For Captain Hayes and his team, the fight was far from over. But as they left the hearing, the first hints of hope began to emerge. There would be accountability, reform, and perhaps a shift in the culture that had allowed ego to overshadow duty for too long. And as they returned to the firehouse, exhausted but resolute, Hayes couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride, not just in his team, but in the possibility of a system that could finally work the way it was meant to. The sparks of change. The next day, the firehouse was buzzing with a mix of anticipation and unease. The hearing's outcome hadn't been announced yet, but word had spread quickly about Officer Carter's brave testimony. Captain Marcus Hayes and his team gathered in the common area, sipping coffee and reflecting on the events that had brought them to this point. "Carter," Jake muttered, shaking his head, "didn't see that coming. Guy's got guts, standing up to his own department like that." "He's a rookie," Sam said, his tone skeptical. "They'll eat him alive for what he said. Guys like Warren don't take kindly to being called out, especially not in public." Hayes leaned against the counter, listening quietly. He could feel the weight of his team's concerns, but there was something else in the air, something that felt like the first glimmers of hope. "He did the right thing," Hayes said finally, setting his coffee mug down. "And that's not easy in a system designed to protect itself. We owe him our respect for that." Drew nodded. "Respect? Sure. But do you think it'll make a difference? Warren's got connections. Guys like him don't go down easily." Hayes's gaze hardened. "Maybe not. But change starts somewhere. And if we back down now, nothing changes at all." The room fell silent, each firefighter lost in their thoughts. They all knew the stakes. What had started as a single incident was now a battle for something much bigger, a fight for accountability, integrity, and the soul of the system they all served. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Carter sat at his desk in the precinct, his nerves frayed. His colleagues had been whispering about him all morning, their glances ranging from curious to outright hostile. Warren had kept his distance, but Carter could feel the man's simmering anger like a storm cloud hanging over him. "Carter," a voice called, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see Sergeant Diaz, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for fairness. Diaz beckoned him into his office, closing the door behind them. "Sir?" Carter asked, his voice cautious. Diaz folded his arms, studying the young officer. "You stirred the pot yesterday," he said bluntly. Carter straightened. "I spoke the truth, sir." Diaz nodded slowly. "I know you did, and I respect that. But you've made yourself a target. Warren's already petitioning to have you reassigned, or worse." Carter's stomach dropped, but he refused to let it show. "With respect, sir, I didn't join this job to keep quiet when something's wrong. What happened that night was wrong. Someone had to say it." Diaz's stern expression softened. "You remind me of myself when I was your age. Idealistic, unafraid to challenge the status quo. But let me give you some advice. Pick your battles wisely. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without allies." Carter nodded, his resolve firm. "Understood, sir. But I can't let this go." Diaz sighed. "Then I suggest you prepare for a fight. You'll need every ounce of courage you've got." The results of the independent review were announced that evening. A joint statement from the mayor's office, the fire department, and the police department condemned the lack of coordination and accountability that had led to the near tragedy. The review called for mandatory cross-training between first responders, ensuring they understood and respected each other's roles in emergencies. It also recommended disciplinary action against Warren for obstructing the rescue operation. At the firehouse, Hayes and his team gathered around the television, watching the announcement unfold. The mayor's measured tone carried weight, but it was the words themselves that struck a chord. "This incident highlights a critical failure in our system," she said, "a failure that could have cost lives. Moving forward, we must prioritize collaboration and accountability between our first responders. It's not about uniforms or titles. It's about protecting the people we serve." Cheers erupted in the room, the tension of the past week giving way to a sense of vindication. Jake slapped Drew on the back, while Sam let out a loud whoop. Even Hayes allowed himself a small smile, though his mind was already on what came next. "This is just the beginning," he said, raising his voice above the noise. "The system doesn't change overnight, but this is a step in the right direction." For Officer Warren, the review's findings were a bitter pill to swallow. He sat in his car outside the precinct, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His career, once untouchable, now hung by a thread. The disciplinary action was severe. A 6-month suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and a permanent mark on his record. A system rebuilt. Months had passed since the fiery night that had nearly claimed lives, not just from the inferno but from the stubborn clash of authority and ego. For Captain Marcus Hayes and his team, life had slowly returned to a new normal, though the scars of that night lingered, both literal and metaphorical. The reforms that had come from the independent review were beginning to take shape, but the true test of change would take more than policies and guidelines. The firehouse, bridging the divide. It was a crisp morning when the first joint training session between the fire and police departments took place. At the firehouse, firefighters and officers milled about awkwardly, waiting for the session to begin. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that arises when opposing forces are forced to confront their differences. Hayes stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, watching the group. His sharp eyes noticed the subtle cues, the rigid postures of the police officers, the wary glances of his firefighters. He knew this wouldn't be easy. "Let's get started," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Today's session isn't just about learning protocols. It's about learning to trust each other." Officer Carter, who had since become a symbol of change within the police department, stepped forward. "He's right," Carter said, his voice steady but firm. "We've all seen what happens when we let pride and assumptions get in the way of our duty. It costs lives. That's not who we are, or who we should be." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, though a few skeptical faces remained. One officer, a burly man named Henderson, crossed his arms. "Easy to say," he muttered, "but respect's a two-way street. You can't expect us to trust people who act like the law doesn't apply to them." Jake, the youngest firefighter on Hayes' team, bristled. "You mean the law that almost got a family killed?" "Yeah, great example." "Jake," Hayes said sharply, silencing him with a glance. He turned back to Henderson. "You're right. Respect is a two-way street. But let me ask you this. What's more important in the middle of an emergency, winning an argument or saving a life?" Henderson shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. Hayes pressed on. "The only way this works is if we stop thinking of ourselves as separate teams. On the scene of an emergency, there's no fire or police. There's only us. And us means trust." The room fell silent, the weight of Hayes' words settling over the group. Slowly, the tension began to ease. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. As he stared out the windshield, his mind raced. Anger, shame, and denial warred within him. But beneath it all, a small, unwelcome thought began to creep in. What if they were right? Warren shook his head, trying to banish the thought. He wasn't the villain they painted him to be. He'd been enforcing the law, maintaining order. That's what he'd always told himself. But as he replayed the events of that night, A nagging doubt took root. The firefighters had saved lives, despite his interference, and Carter's words, spoken with quiet conviction, echoed in his mind. It's about saving lives, not control. For the first time in years, Warren questioned the path he had chosen, and the man he had become. Back at the firehouse, Hayes sat alone in his office, reviewing the new interdepartmental training guidelines. The reforms were a step forward, but he knew there was still much work to be done. Culture didn't change with a single policy. It changed with actions, repeated over time. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Officer Carter standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Officer Carter," Hayes said, gesturing for him to enter. "What brings you here?" Carter stepped inside, his hands clasped nervously. "I just wanted to thank you, Captain, for standing your ground, for showing me what real courage looks like." Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer. "You're the one who deserves thanks. What you did at that hearing wasn't easy." Carter shrugged. "It felt like the right thing to do, but it's cost me a lot." Hayes nodded. "It usually does. But doing the right thing isn't about the rewards. It's about knowing you stood up when it mattered." Carter smiled faintly. "You think things will get better?" Hayes's expression softened. "They already have. You're proof of that." As Carter left, Hayes returned to his desk, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. The fight for change was far from over, but tonight he allowed himself to hope, because sometimes it only took a single spark to ignite a revolution. Warren's reckoning. Across town, Lieutenant Warren sat in his sparsely furnished apartment, staring at a pile of paperwork that had been collecting dust on his dining table. His suspension had turned his life upside down. The man who had once walked the precinct halls with unshakable confidence now found himself alone, grappling with the consequences of his actions. The suspension had been a wake-up call, but what haunted him most were the faces of the firefighters and the family they had saved. In the quiet of his apartment, their voices echoed in his mind. Hayes's unyielding calm, Carter's bold conviction, and the mother's sobs of gratitude as she clung to her child. For years, Warren had operated under the belief that authority equated to control, but that night had shattered that illusion. Control hadn't saved lives. Collaboration had. And for the first time, he wondered if his pursuit of authority had blinded him to his true purpose. Determined to change, Warren reached out to the precinct's training division. If he couldn't erase his past mistakes, he could at least ensure others didn't repeat them. A test of unity. The true test of the new system came unexpectedly, as these tests often do. On a rainy autumn evening, a gas explosion rocked a residential neighborhood, setting 2 homes ablaze and leaving several people trapped. The fire department and police arrived simultaneously, their sirens slicing through the downpour. Hayes leaped from the truck, barking orders to his team. "Drew, Jake, get the hoses running. Sam, assess the structural integrity. Eli, set up a triage area for the injured." Officer Carter approached, drenched but focused. "What can we do to assist, Captain?" Hayes appreciated the question, a stark contrast to the confrontations of the past. "We'll need your help with crowd control and evacuation. Make sure everyone stays clear of the blast radius." Carter nodded and turned to his fellow officers. "You heard the man. Let's move." The operation was chaotic but efficient. Firefighters battled the flames while police officers directed traffic, kept bystanders safe, and assisted with the evacuation. Despite the urgency and the danger, the 2 teams worked together seamlessly, a stark contrast to the disjointed response of the past. As the firefighters entered one of the burning homes, a section of the ceiling collapsed, trapping Hayes and Jake inside. Thick smoke filled the air, and visibility was nearly zero. "We've got to move," Hayes shouted, his voice muffled by his mask. "The structure's unstable." Jake nodded, his face pale but determined. Together, they navigated the debris, searching for an exit. Just as panic began to creep in, they heard voices outside. "Captain Hayes, "Jake, can you hear us?" It was Carter, his voice steady but urgent. "Here," Hayes shouted. "We're pinned down near the back entrance." Moments later, Carter and two other officers appeared, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. With their combined strength, they cleared the debris blocking the exit, allowing Hayes and Jake to escape just as another section of the house collapsed. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but the mood was one of triumph. The fires had been extinguished, the injured were being treated, and every life had been accounted for. Hayes and Carter exchanged a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had grown between them. A new legacy. In the weeks that followed, the gas explosion became a case study in the power of collaboration. The incident was hailed as a turning point, a shining example of what could be achieved when first responders worked together. For Hayes, it was validation of everything he'd fought for. The firehouse began hosting regular joint training sessions, and the tension between firefighters and police gradually gave way to camaraderie. The road ahead wasn't without challenges, but the foundation for change had been laid. As for Warren, he returned to duty a changed man. He approached his role with newfound humility, focusing on building bridges rather than walls. His journey of redemption was far from over, but he was willing to put in the work. One evening, as the firehouse quieted down, Hayes stood outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The events of the past months had tested him and his team in ways they hadn't anticipated. But as he looked out over the city, he felt a sense of pride, not just in what they'd accomplished, but in the legacy they were building. Because in the end, it wasn't about uniforms or titles, it was about people. And as long as there were people willing to fight for what was right, there was hope for a better future.